All right, so let's talk about how to make these rhythm collages. And you want to again start with your draft and then get your board and maybe sketch out your idea on your board even just quickly and lightly. It doesn't have to be very detailed, but just enough to give you a plan. And if you notice that your piece has maybe what you call a background color, like a dominant background color, you want to start there. If you start with these small foreground shapes, you're going to have a lot of trouble filling in your background, and then that'll lead to a lot more kind of stress and frustration and um, we can avoid that by starting with the background instead. So I changed this from black to green, and then once I had the background kind of filled in, I started thinking about how to arrange some of those foreground shapes. And what I did was lay them down first before I glued them, see how they were looking. I do suggest as much as possible that you lay down your pieces before you glue them, just get a sense of how they're working. Um, you also want to keep your pieces from being too big or too large because we're mimicking quilts, and quilts really are pieces of fabric sewn together. So what we don't want to do is have these giant sheets of color that aren't cut down and overlap because it won't look as interesting. Now you're going to see the addition of some newspaper on the side, so you're welcome to use other scraps of paper just like the G's Ben quilters did. So newspaper, magazines, scrap paper around your home, all of those are totally available and at play. Now I also want to direct your attention to this bottom section down here. Look at how changing the direction of those shapes makes a much bigger difference between feeling a little bit dynamic to much more dynamic. So keep that in mind as you arrange your shapes. How can you really increase the dynamic shapes you're working with? Then you can see here, this arrow is put into my static shapes. Those were fairly horizontal and vertical lines, so not a whole lot of movement right there. And lastly, those little areas are also where I added some other values and colors. So you're welcome to have your own, to make up your own colors and papers to use. You have access to mixed media paper, watercolors, colored pencils, that's all available. And you can definitely take those supplies, and you don't have to have them be a minority of your design like I did. You can have them be the majority. You can barely use any of the colored paper. You can use mostly your own making of paper. The way you divide that is totally up to you and your artistic choices. And now look at this final example, just review our art requirements. So we have no white in the design and also none of that whiteboard visible. And you have tints, tones, and shades all in play. And lastly, you also have all that excess paper cut off. So it's a nice clean look for presentation. So to revisit the learning goals, hopefully you can see how this artwork demonstrates or kind of references the visual language of the G's Ben quilts. And then the rhythm for this one would be unexpected or random, because even though there is some alternating happening between the colors and their location and their angles, for the most part, those alternating components aren't at a predictable interval. So you really can't decide, you really can't know how far apart they're going to be when they change and in what order they're going to change. So because you can't predict that, this would be unpredictable or random. And then we also identified where our dynamic and static shapes are. We have on the sides, on the border, we have our two areas of static shapes. And all through the center, we have all of our dynamic shapes that are all at angles. So if you have any questions, obviously reach out to your teacher. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing what you guys make with this.